When Anne very kindly invited me to speak to you about the work of my charity, I thought it might be perhaps more interesting for you to actually hear how the work of my charity has fitted into my sort of spiritual journey of the last 30 odd years. There's perhaps limited interest in a charity that's operating in Nepal, which is 3,500 miles away. So I hope what I'm going to say is of more interest. And it's a very sort of personal statement, really. As you'll hear from my accent, I'm not from around these parts. I was born in County Derry in Northern Ireland, and you could say I was sort of born in the Bible Belt of Northern Ireland, of sort of Paisley country. And it was a very sort of puritanical, sort of strict kind of society. They used to say that in Ballymena, which is one of Paisley's towns, in the children's play park, they used to chain up the swings on a Sunday so the kids couldn't play on them. I don't know if that's true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was indeed the case. So it was a very sort of strict religious upbringing, lots of church, Sunday school, and with hindsight, it was a bit too strict. I found Sundays incredibly tedious when I was a child, interminable. However, the one thing that I would say that came out of that upbringing, which was of immense value, was, I suppose, a perspective that carried me through the trauma that I faced in 1999, and I'll come on to that in a second. I don't know how I've managed without that core faith, if you like. I went to Queen's University, I became a dentist, I joined the British Army, and I was having a great time in the army, more money than sense, as they say, and doing that little bit of seeing the world, and Germany and Belize and wherever. And that came to a sort of an abrupt end when I got married in 1988, and happily so. Esther was a Dutch Jewish lady. She'd been a social worker who was working with the survivors of the Holocaust, fellow Dutch Jewish people who survived the camps and their families. And she did that really meaningful work for many years as a very young woman. I mean, it was incredibly challenging stuff. That led her into studying law, and at the time we married in 1988, she just passed her Masters in Law, which she had done in her spare time. Obviously there was a mismatch in religion. I was a Northern Irish Presbyterian and she was an Orthodox Jew, but according to the Jewish faith our marriage didn't exist, but wasn't recognised. But setting that aside, we lived in perfect harmony, and I think neither of us were really sort of regular attenders at church or synagogue. She would come with me to Remembrance Sunday in the church, I would go to the synagogue for Passover, and we kind of coexisted like that, really. And when we kept a kosher kitchen and so on and so forth. But, I think we were both just very broad-minded and to say, very happily married. Our careers progressed, and in 1998, Esther was appointed a judge. She had reached the sort of the pinnacle of her legal career. And by this stage, I was a lieutenant colonel in the army. And I think probably people looking in on us would have thought, well, there's a really great couple, the original dinkies, double income, no kids, and jet setting around the place and so on. But actually there was an underlying sadness, and that was that Esther really wanted children. And the children didn't come along in spite of the best efforts of medical practice and so on. And very tragically, Esther took her own life in January 1999, 23 years ago. And as I'm going to skip through that subject, not because I'm not comfortable talking about it, it's just because of time constraints. But the thing that really, I suppose, comes out of that was that aside from dealing with all that kind of emotional turmoil and everything that you can imagine that's stirred up by the trauma and the horror of it all, I suppose I felt I was kind of put on the spot, really, where I knew that I couldn't continue professionally doing what I had been doing, because almost immediately dentistry and the army became absolutely meaningless. I knew I needed to find something else that would give me some kind of internal satisfaction. I couldn't carry on as if nothing had happened, basically. And I also felt, there was a need to respond to what had happened, and respond in some kind of a very positive way, because although Esther had been defeated, if you like, I was still there and I could carry on, and I really wanted to perpetuate her values and her memory. And looking at it objectively, there I was, suddenly widowed at the age of 38. I had no children, of course. My parents were already deceased, and there was absolutely nothing to stop me changing my life. And I really felt I was on that spot of, you've got me. I had to do something, and it really was that you tell me what you want me to do, and I will do it. And the amazing thing is that I have never actually grieved for that loss. It's a really strange thing to say, but I have responded in a positive way. And literally within days of Esther's death, I had decided that I was leaving the army, leaving dentistry, and I was going to set up a charity in her memory, and I was going to operate in Nepal, which is quite a bizarre choice. I always say in sort of HR terms, if you're sort of ticking boxes, I didn't have any boxes that you could tick. I mean, I knew nothing about setting up a children's charity. I knew nothing about Nepal. I'd never been there before. So talk about a leap of faith. It certainly was that. But it was very firmly embedded in my mind that I was going to be doing this. And that psalm of, I to the hills will turn my eyes. There's something about Nepal that seems to attract people who've never been there before. Maybe it's that allure of the mountains. I don't know, but it was there anyhow. And of course, with my army connections, I was aware of the Gurkhas and their service to the Crown. So, having taken that decision in inverted commas, I then experienced the most bizarre series of coincidences, and I don't really harbour regrets for the past at all. But if I do harbour one little tiny regret, is I didn't keep a diary because every day there was a coincidence. And when you start getting coincidences with that kind of frequency, and also the magnitude of them, you kind of felt something's happening here, something very unusual. And sadly I didn't document it at the time, but I knew there was something happening around me. And I think if there was one thing that emerged for me spiritually at that time, it was an absolute conviction that there's a God. And it's not something that people talk about really, this, you call it synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. But I know that one of my friends who's a vicar up north, he's said to me in the past that his bishop used to say to him, I don't believe in coincidences, but I pray coincidences happen. And I was getting day after day after day after day, and it was the magnitude of them. And I'll give you an example, which is a little bit of a story, but bear with me. The following month, in February 1999, I happened to be at Waterloo railway station. And I just had the sense there was someone there that I knew, and I looked around and I saw this lady who was the wife of the one person that I called to the house on the day of Esther's death. We were very private people. I didn't want any people around, just this one guy who I knew was really reliable. And his wife was there, and she said, oh, hi, and came over and we had a chat. And she said, I believe you're going to Nepal. And I said, well, yes, eventually. And she said, well, I've picked up a couple of books which I got from my uncle, and I must send them to you. You might find them useful reading. And this is one of the books. I still have it. And it goes by the very unlikely title of Don't Let the Goats Eat the Loquat Trees. And it's written by a guy called Tom Hale. And I got these two paperbacks. I thought, well, great, okay. Actually, I was very, very busy at that time, was sorting my life out, and I didn't have time really to sit down and study it. But in August 1999, 6-7 months later, my resignation had come through from the army, and suddenly I was like a free man again. And I decided I would realise sort of a minor ambition, and I wanted to walk the coast-to-coast walk that crosses the north of England. So it goes from the Irish Sea to the North Sea, and it takes you through the Lake District, the Pennines, the Yorkshire Dales, and the North Yorkshire Moors. and I reckon it was about 190 miles, I think. I'd always wanted to do it, and I could now actually do this trek for the first time without worrying about leave and how much time I had and when I had to get back and so on. And it did give me that sort of sense of freedom, but at the start of the walk I went to stay with friends who had a bed and breakfast up in Leyburn in North Yorkshire, and really old friends. And I spent 2 or 3 nights with them, and I took these books with me, and I thought, well, I'll read the book as I trek. And I started reading the first 2 or 3 chapters of this while I was staying at that bed and breakfast. And I was absolutely amazed because this guy, Tom Hale, was a medical student, American medical student, and as a student he felt the call to go to Nepal. Again, a place he'd never been to before. And he described exactly in this book the experience of things happening, coincidences. People started giving him things, and I remember saying to Norma who ran the B&B, I said, this has been exactly my experience. It's in this book. It's the same kind of thing. I remember someone said to me once that her perception of what had happened to me in that year, it was like letting the air out of a car tire. You just opened the valve and suddenly there was this rush, and that was what he experienced. It's what I experienced. So that was that. Put the book into my rucksack. I just read the first 3 or 4 chapters. Headed off to the west coast. Started the trek, and on about day 10 of the trek, I was in the North Yorkshire moors in the middle of nowhere, and my sort of modus operandi was that I had my tent in my rucksack. I would try and find a friendly pub somewhere so I could put the tent in the back garden, and then you could have the dinner at the pub or whatever. And I found such a pub, and I put my tent up, went in at 6 p.m, sat down. There was nobody in this little pub at all. And then a sort of elderly man came in, and he said, "Oh, can you mind if I join you?" And I said, "Yeah, fine." So he sat down with me, and we started talking, and it was very interesting because he happened to be the chairman of a charity, and as I was setting up a charity, this was of course very relevant to me. And his charity was called the Translation Trust, and it was all about translating Bibles into obscure languages like Azerbaijani or something. And he was the chairman of that charity. And then I told him what my intentions were about Nepal, and he said to me, he says, "If you're going to get involved in Nepal, I must put you in contact with my best friend from my university days. His name is Tom Hale." And talk about goosebumps going up and down your arms and so on. That was one of so many coincidences. That's probably one of the biggest ones that I had. And when something like that happens, you kind of think, this isn't a coincidence. That really, the chances of that are just zilch. I will race forward very, very quickly. It's a very long story. Obviously, I've written my memoir, so I'll not delay the service too much. But in short, I went to Nepal in November 1999. First visit there, I had no idea what I was going to do at all. And while I was there was an article on the front page of the Kathmandu Post, and it was about Nepalese children, innocent children who were in prison with their parents. And they were in prison because there was no one to look after them. And it said there was about 100 kids or something like that. And I thought, well, that's a sort of manageable number in the midst of all the need that you see in Nepal. So let's see if we can do something about that. So I set up a refuge, and we started negotiating the release of these children from prisons. And 1999 ended on an incredible high, and that was the release of the first 7 children from a prison in Kathmandu. So, the year seemed to feel like it ended on as much of a high as it had been a low at the start. It was quite a remarkable year. That story was then, eventually it was profiled in the Daily Telegraph. It was cover story in the weekend section, July 2000, in the days when people read newspapers. They don't anymore. That led to it was like a dream start for the charity. There was this avalanche of correspondence and so on. And it led to a researcher from the Gloria Honeyford programme getting in touch with me, rather a producer. And I ended up marrying her, so I got rather more out of that media exposure than I'd expected. So The work in Nepal continued, more children, releases. In November 2001, I need to get my decade right, the government of Nepal ruled that children could no longer be in jail. I have no idea if that was cause and effect, and I can't really claim cause and effect, but what I do know is that the nature of my work was in the newspapers right around the world, and I have a feeling that was causing some embarrassment, but I can't prove that. It'd be very strange if it wasn't. At that point, I decided to shift emphasis, find a new cause, carry on looking after those children, of course. And we started working on a totally new area, which was the rescue of trafficked children, little children, mainly girls, who were being trafficked from Nepal into India, ostensibly to become performers inside Indian circuses. And these were kind of prisons in disguise. Once the kids were in there, they couldn't get out again, and they were subject to all kinds of abuse, physical, psychological and sexual. No one had ever done this research before. We were the first to do it. And having got the research, then we decided that we would have to do something about it. This was quite a different sort of work from what I'd done before, because this was actually very dangerous. Taking children out of prison was kind of course, vitally important. It was neither here nor there in terms of affecting people's businesses, but if you start disrupting circuses, that's a different ballgame. Anyhow, I decided at that point, this was about 2004, that if this big challenge was going to be undertaken, I'd have to be in Nepal myself and base myself there. So I moved with Bev in October 2004, ostensibly for 2 years. That was just a ridiculous time frame, but ostensibly 2 years. But I did say I wasn't going to come back to the UK until we had sorted out this problem of children in circuses. And essentially what we did was to start conducting rescue operations cross-border into India in conjunction with the police and the authorities. And in those, it became 8 years in the end, we rescued 350 children from circuses. A further 350 approximately were released voluntarily because the circuses didn't want to face prosecution and it was all becoming too difficult. So around about 700 kids were freed. We also tracked down the traffickers. There were 19 of them, put them in jail. We managed the returnees, and in April 2011, the Indian Supreme Court responded to some work that we had initiated, and they outlawed the use of children as performers inside circuses. Essentially, we had shut down a child trafficking route, which is an unprecedented result in that part of the world. And that was that. In the meantime, we picked up a couple of Nepalese children. Alicia was born in 2006, Joe born in 2008. And I'm very proud that when we did return in 2012, we came back with a daughter and a son. And what wonderful kids they've been, film cameramen and all the rest of it. So thank you, Joe. I'm moving on very quickly. I shut down a second child trafficking route, which I won't talk about, but that's in the book. When I came back, took a short break, and then I kind of felt that I had done what I wanted to do in Esther's memory, and it wasn't about a plaque on the wall, which was very important, very nice, and so on. For me, the memorial was closing down those 2 child trafficking routes, and that's an enduring outcome. And I was very pleased to do that. And I kind of felt that I was getting to a stage where I wanted to do something that was more in line with my own interests and passions. And when I was a little boy, your sort of benevolent aunts and uncles would say, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" And I used to say conservationist, because I was very influenced by Jacques Cousteau and David Attenborough. He was still going in those days. And I thought, yeah, that's what I really want to do. So I became a dentist instead. So now I've got my charity, which is based in Ledston, where I live. So it's a home-based charity. We don't have big offices or anything like that. And my charity, which is called Pipal Tree, is working in a range of areas, but primarily in the area of the response to the climate change and the climate crisis. We're still doing historical stuff in terms of rescuing children and doing their rehabilitation. These days it's rape survivors, is very high on our priority. And that's kind of where we are at the minute. In terms of the spiritual side of things, as I say, the experiences of 20 years ago, immediately after Esther's death, convinced me that yes, there really is a God, a God who sort of keeps a very low profile, bizarrely, and who understands that, we don't know, but definitely there's something going on around us. I think your antennae need to be tuned into it to a certain extent as well. You need to be looking out for these things. I say why it's not more overt, I don't know. Moving right forward to the last 4 or 5 years and where I am at the minute. I think 3 or 4 years ago I was very influenced by what you might call the new atheists, and by that I mean people like the late Christopher Hitchens and a guy called Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. All these people who've got a lot to say about evolution in the Bible and goodness knows what else. And they're very impressive to listen to and to read. But I've certainly in the last year and a bit come to the conclusion that what they're saying is nonsense in terms of things like I just do not believe that what the variety of what we see around us has not come from chance, and I just don't believe it, I'm afraid. I think the other thing that was very much in my which changed my mindset was that over the last couple of years, I started reading other books. And there's one that really comes to mind, which is by a guy called Professor John Lennox, who is a professor of mathematics at Oxford. And sometimes you see these debates on television or on YouTube, and it's Richard Dawkins, the other person's John Lennox. And I have to say, John Lennox seems to run rings around Richard Dawkins. John Lennox is a fellow countryman of mine. I guess he's now in his mid-70s. As a mathematician, he certainly knows what he's talking about. He's a professor at Oxford. His book, which I recommend, is called God's Undertaker. He's written many books, but that book in particular, he looks at the possibilities of matter existing purely for mathematical reasons on the basis of chance. And it really is beyond infinitesimal, and that's quite different from discussing evolution, which is even as unlikely to my mind. The thing that I like about John Lennox is very, very readable stuff, and he talks about how it's so easy to confuse. As a very nice example, he talks about how science can explain how the kettle boils to make a cup of tea. Science can do that. There's no mystery around that at all. Science will explain the mechanism. It won't answer the question why. It won't tell you that the kettle is being boiled because your auntie wants a cup of tea. And I just love things like that. So there are huge limitations on science, and for John Lennox and so many other theologians, science has its limitations that can't be overcome. And then there was something really odd happened about 2 years ago, Christmas appeal. I had a donation came into the charity, and I'm not breaching any confidences here, from a lady called Morna Hooker. And it's one of those names that's quite odd, and I thought, I must just Google that, And it turned out this is a professor of divinity at Cambridge. And Morna's in her mid-90s now, and still going strong. And she's written a whole series of books, New Testament scholar. The one book that I latched onto was called Not Ashamed of the Cross. And she dissects the crucifixion and the resurrection and so on. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. And I think really reading material like that, I very much came to that conclusion of, I suppose, having been in this position of being broadly a theist, having respect for the Jewish faith, Christian faith, and you go to Nepal, there's Hindu, there's Buddhist, all these faiths, and you become quite broad-minded. And I think it is good to be broad-minded in a way, insofar as our religion is very much a product of our birth when it comes down to it. Let's face it. However, I sort of came to this very clear conclusion of, this whole business of the resurrection, which is absolutely central to the Christian faith. And it's, I suppose the key question for anybody should be is, did this happen, yes or no? If it didn't happen, if it's a little nonsense, then that's that. But if it's true, it's the most important thing that's ever happened to humanity. And I just sort of look at that, and you see, you've got clever people who tear the Bible to shreds. People like Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar, professor, but also an atheist, and he goes through and he picks up all the anomalies that are in there. And it's very easy to do that, but actually for me, reading these stories almost afresh after a long break, I sort of reached the conclusion that there is something in here, and a lot of it is actually circumstantial. And if you just sort of imagine for yourself that you're having Christmas lunch, and someone that you have lost, deceased, actually turns up in the room with you, and sits there and has his or her lunch with you, and you can touch that person, other people in the room see them, touch them, and they stay with you for quite some period of time, that would have the most transformative impact on you or anybody else that's in that room. And if you kind of look at the situation immediately after the crucifixion, where the disciples were all in hiding, and because they knew that there was going to be a purge and they were going to be next, and crucifixion, of course, an awful death. And as Morna Hooker pointed out in her book, the shame that was associated with crucifixion, forgetting the violence and the trauma and some of the shame that went with that within Judaism, it was absolutely appalling. They were in hiding, they were terrified. Why is it that soon afterwards they're out proclaiming the gospel without the slightest hint of fear? Why does that spread through the Roman Empire within a matter of a few decades? Why is it that around about, I think it's about half of the apostles ended up being crucified themselves? What was it that turned Saul into Paul, that converted him from being a killer, effectively, a hitman, into again effectively laying down his own life in Rome? There was something really big happened, and as I say, for me it's largely circumstantial. But that's primarily why I'm a Christian now, and why I'm proud to say that. That's where my spiritual journey has brought me. And that's about as much as I want to say. I think the only thing I would add is that this morning I was having a little exchange on Facebook with a young woman, and she was a girl that I brought out of a circus in 2007. I think she must be 18 or something like that, and she's now working in the Gulf States. And she just picked up when I was all eyes, these messages were going back and forward. And she just at the end of it, she said, "Oh, they all call me Daddy." And then there's about 1,000 kids out there now who have been either in prison, they were on the streets, former street children, or they came from the circuses, and they all call me Daddy, and that's fine. And she just said, "Thank you, Daddy, for what you did for me." And I just replied to her, I said, "No, thank God for what he did for all of us."